Welcome, everyone. I know that some additional folks will trickle in the coming minutes, and we'll be tracking the waiting room to make sure that they are admitted. But why don't we go ahead and get started? My name's Marty West. I'm Deputy Director of the Program on Education Policy and Governance, and also on the faculty at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And so I'm particularly excited to be introducing my colleague at HGSE, Peter Blair, who is an economist who works on many different aspects of the economics of higher education and K-12 education, as well as the changing demands of the workforce and how schools can be preparing students for those changing demands. He arrived at Harvard. Peter, is this your third year?
Yeah, it is.
Third year, and he's been a wonderful addition to our faculty. We were able to recruit him from the Clemson Department of Economics, and we're very glad that we were able to do that. So, Peter, I'm going to turn it over to you. Please feel free to let us know how you want people to interact along the way, whether you want to be monitoring the chat or encouraging people to raise their hands. But we'll let you dictate what works best for you.
Yeah, 100%, Marty. And just in terms of norms, how does it work? Is it like typically people just ask questions throughout, or do you prefer to have questions at the end, or what's the preferred?
We'll defer to your judgment and preferences as speakers, but I think people often like to have the ability to have their questions answered along the way if they arise. And I know you're comfortable with that as a general practice. So.
Yeah, so 100%. So feel free to ask questions throughout. If you can, please type your questions in the chat and then unmute. That way I can have a record of all of the questions and I can be able to share those with my co-authors. So thank you very much for having me here, Marty, and the whole team. I'm very excited to present to you this paper, which is entitled A National Study of School Spending and House Prices. This is joint work with one of my former PhD students, Kenneth Whaley, who now works at the University of Houston, and Patrick Bayo, who's at Duke University. Before starting, I'd like to talk a little bit about my research group. None of this work is done in isolation. And for the students who are in the room, I just want you to know that faculty really enjoy working with students. This is a picture of our group from the ASSA meetings. I think this must have been now 2 years ago, pre-pandemic. And a big theme in a lot of the work that we do is trying to identify imperfections in the market for education and to really assess what are the labor market impacts of these imperfections, and then to think about alternative labor market signals or fixes for some of these frictions that we observe in the labor market. Just to give you a sampling of some of the other work that are part of our research portfolio, we have a paper looking at occupational licensing, where we show that licensing reduces racial and gender wage gaps, specifically because the license functions as a signal of non-felony status for Black men. And we also work trying to understand why is it that elite universities like Harvard have not expanded over time, work looking at individuals who don't have college degrees and trying to think about the ways in which their work experience could be a type of labor market signal as well. And then I have a paper with one of our PhD students, Salman Khan, looking at inequality in the funding of higher education from the federal government. And Kenneth Whaley, he is the gentleman in this red tie here. He's one of the co-authors on this current paper. Okay. Let me start off by just laying out what are some very clear aims of this paper. So we want to do 4 things in this paper. The first is we want to look at what are the impacts of school spending on house prices. And we want to do this nationally. So there's been a lot of work. So our colleague Tom Kane has done work looking at the impact of school quality on house prices. I think it's in Charlotte. And what we want to do is we want to really build on the work of Tom and many others by thinking about a study of a national study of the capitalization of school spending into house prices. Secondarily, what we want to do is to understand the extent to which there might be differences in the type of spending and how that's capitalized into house prices. It could be the case that salary and non-salary expenditures are differentially valued by households, and we're going to capture that. The work on the salary spending is going to be particularly new to the literature, where we've not seen as much work looking at the capitalization of salary expenditures. Then the third thing that we're going to do is to quantify the impact of taxes on house prices to see the extent to which keeping fixed the level of school spending, to what extent do households have a distaste for taxes. And in the fourth piece, what we're going to do is combine all of these elasticities of house prices with respect to school spending and taxes to really come up with a test for whether or not school spending is going to be efficient on the margin. So those are going to be the four things that we do. And let me just say very briefly, like how we're going to think about this efficiency test, just to preview what we're going to do later on in the paper. The core idea is the following. If we're able to estimate the elasticity or the responsiveness of house prices with respect to school spending and taxes, we can then do the following exercise with those estimates. We can look at what would happen if you were to increase taxes by 1%, take that full lump sum of money and put it into school spending. Would that on net increase house prices? And if it is the case that a tax-funded increase in school expenditures would increase house prices, then that would suggest that spending is inefficiently low. If the opposite were true, then that would suggest that spending is inefficiently high. If it's precisely zero, then at the margin, spending is going to be efficient. And so those are the four key aims of the paper that I'm going to present today.
Peter, can I jump in with a quick question about the second one there,
Yeah,
salary
sure,
and
Marty.
non-salary expenditures?
Yeah.
I know you're going to find differences between them, or else you wouldn't be previewing that as a focus, but there are obviously other ways in which you could break down expenditure. So sort of what was the, I don't know, rationale or thinking behind that theoretically as the right way to cut the data?
Yeah, great question, Marty. So the intuition for that is there are some papers in literature that show that when school districts increase spending on salaries, that you see an impact on test scores. And there's also literature looking at the impact of increases on infrastructure spending and like how that translates to impacts on test scores. And so in a sense, we're taking our guidance from the literature in terms of this like very natural division between these two types of inputs. But if you have suggestions of like other ways that we could think about the breakdown, like we're happy to like cut the data in other ways too. Right. Thanks, Marty. There are two kind of big motivations for this project. So the first is there's been a huge literature written on the extent to which school spending matters. And since the publication of the Coleman report, this has been a very contested question in the field of education, also in the field of economics. And more recent kind of findings like using causal identification and quasi-random variation in school spending has been pointing a lot more strongly in the direction that increased school spending causally improves test scores, increases wages, reduces adult poverty, and also like increases intergenerational mobility. And so with these new findings in mind, the motivation of this study is then to say, do we find corroborating evidence that households are willing to pay more for houses that are located in school districts that also spend more money? And so in some sense, you can think about this as to the extent that parents are forward-looking, they would be willing to pay more for these future later improved life outcomes for their kids by pay more for houses that are located in school districts that spend more money. So that's the first motivation. The second motivation comes from an equally old question that's in public finance. And so what I've done here is like pulled up this quote from Thibault's paper in 1956, where he observes that, in the field of economics, there's been a lot of debate about like, how do you efficiently provide public goods in light of the free rider problem? And as we all know, the Thibault solution really says that if we can think about using local provision as a mechanism to generate competition, you could drive at efficiency. And so what we're going to do in this paper by trying to examine the efficiency of spending on public schools is really to provide an empirical context to be able to kind of like test some of these ideas. Now, in practice, the assumptions of Thibault are not going to hold, so we all know that that's true. And so what we're going to do is to really rely on an implication of the Thibault test that doesn't necessarily require all of the assumptions of Thibault to be correct. And that test is going to come from a paper by Oates in 1969, where the core idea is going to be that if you're in a district where more of the public good is provided, then house prices should be higher. But then the way to test whether or not that's efficient is to see if on the margin, tax-funded increases in the provision of the public good lead to increases in house prices. And so that's going to be the core thing that we're going to do at the end of the paper when we bring together the two key elasticities that we're going to be estimating in this paper. Let me start off by talking about some of the empirical challenges in terms of like doing this. So in terms of like tackling these questions, like there's a host of endogeneity issues that you have to deal with in terms of the relationship between like school spending and house prices and taxes. Like so many of these things are going to be co-determined, and that's been a challenge in this literature. There have been several creative approaches to overcome this in the literature. So for example, there are the boundary discontinuity designs that I mentioned earlier. So we have Tom Kane's work, also my co-author Pat Blair and Sandy Black's very influential studies, where what you do is compare two houses on the opposite side of the opposite sides of a school attendance zone boundary. And then you look at differences in the house prices as really capitalizing differences in the school quality. And another approach could be to look at like very close bond referenda. And this has been done in the context of California. And so what we're going to do is really build on these approaches to provide an empirical framework that's going to allow us to think about adopting like quasi-random variation in school spending and also taxes that's also going to be national in scope. And so let me outline the steps in terms of what we're going to do within the context of this paper. So the first thing that we're going to do is to use the school finance reforms to isolate plausibly exogenous variation in both school spending and local tax revenue. The quasi-random variation in school spending is something that has already been done in the literature. So if you think about the Jackson, Johnson, and Persico paper in the QJE, what they show is that you can separate out the school districts based on their pre-reform spending quartiles, and the school districts that were in the lowest spending quartiles prior to the reforms are going to experience like the largest increases in spending after the reforms. What we show is that formally those instruments are going to be over-identified, and you can actually tease apart as well exogenous variation in taxes from that. Let me defer kind of like getting into the technical dimensions of that until we get to later on in the talk, but that's going to be like the source of quasi-random variation that we're going to be exploiting in this paper. And then secondly, we're going to use that variation and pair that with a 3-decade-long time series of house prices at the census tract level to really begin to test for capitalization of both the school spending and the taxes into house prices. And then finally, we're going to combine those two elasticities to implement the Oates test that I mentioned earlier. So this is going to be our plan of attack. Let me stop and ask if there are any questions before I preview the key findings. Okay. So there are going to be 4 headline findings. So the first is that school spending is going to be positively capitalized into prices. That's good news. The second key finding is going to be that the capitalization of salary spending into house prices is going to explain most of the overall capitalization. The third is that holding school spending fixed, we're going to find that property taxes are going to be negatively capitalized into house prices, which also makes sense. If I'm giving you the same bundle of school spending, like of course you'd want to pay less taxes, right? That's the intuition behind that result. And the fourth is we're going to be able to combine our spending elasticity and our tax elasticity to show that raising taxes to spend on salary inputs would actually increase house prices. And that's going to be large, positive, and statistically significant, which is going to be suggestive of the fact that spending on salary inputs is inefficiently low. So those are the core key findings. In terms of our contributions, we think about our contributions in 2 ways. So intellectually, the first thing that we're doing is providing national estimates of the capitalization of school spending into house prices using quasi-random variation. And we're doing this separately by type of expenditure too. And so we think that that's like the first contribution. There have been lots of studies that have looked at capitalization of test scores and other attributes of schools into house prices at the local level. What we're doing is we're actually looking at the reduced form effect of spending in general and spending by type. The second intellectual contribution is we're going to be able to make empirical progress on this really old question in public finance as to whether or not locally providing public goods can result in efficient provision. And we're going to do this using modern methods. Methodologically, what we're going to be able to do is to come up with an approach to these questions that allows us to use publicly available data And so all of the data that we use are going to be, aggregate data at the school district or the census tract level. And so what that allows us to do is to have like really broad range across both time and across space. And in practice, this is going to lower the data requirements for being able to answer these two questions. And potentially, it's also going to increase the generalizability of the results that we find in this study too. And so we think that this is a good trade-off to make. We have a lot of really well-identified studies that look at a particular state at a particular point in time to estimate the impact of school spending on house prices. We have a lot less evidence in terms of like thinking about like what these estimates would look like nationally. And so these are going to be our core contributions to the literature. All right, now I'm going to talk through the data, and then I'm going to talk through the empirical strategy and then the results. So that's the plan going forward. Any questions so far before I jump into the data?
Well, Peter, I'll ask one question, which is you're emphasizing the value of the nationally representative generalizable estimates that you're going to present. But I could also imagine a focus, given the data you have, on geographic variation in findings, right? Like, so is spending high, efficient in some places and inefficiently low, inefficiently high in others? Is that an avenue that sort of you're setting aside for future work, or less of a priority?
Yeah, good question. So there are trade-offs. So in some sense, like the more generalizability that you have, in some sense, it's kind of like you got to zoom out a little bit more. And if you want to say something about a particular context, you have to zoom in a little bit more and have like more fine-grained data. And so we think that this study is better suited in terms of kind of like making this kind of macro point. There are some ways of cutting the data that we think could be useful. So we have looked at this separately by like urban versus like rural and suburban. So at that broad level of geographic kind of disaggregation, like we think that what we're doing here could still be reliable, but to really like pinpoint a specific geography, we think that like some of the existing studies that look at the house price capitalization would be better suited for looking at a particular local context. Hassan, I see your hand is raised.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. So I had a quick question about how we were sort of measuring efficiency. Is the premise that if there is still an increased willingness to pay, insofar as like, house prices go up, it sort of means that spending is inefficient? From what I'm saying, that's what we're saying. So is that necessarily a true statement in all cases, or is that premised on like economic principles that don't necessarily map out to education? Because you could imagine that unlike some goods where like I have power, it's meeting my needs, I'm good. Education is sort of seen as this, like, it can always be better, right? There's always this increased opportunity that parents sort of always want better and better for their children. And so is the elasticity there something that can actually give us some sort of an understanding of actual efficiency, or are there other considerations that need to be accounted for when it comes to education spending in particular?
Yeah, so there are two ways to take the question. So the first is the first way that I hear, or the dominant way, is that there's diminishing like marginal utility for like most goods, but maybe not for education. It's like maybe what happens is you have like kind of like increasing marginal utility for education. It's like to get into Harvard, it's like maybe you will go and cure cancer or something like that just to get into Harvard versus like the school that's epsilon below. I think that that's an empirical question that would rely on the estimate. So if, for example, like, people are willing to pay more and more in some sense, like that would mean that what we're finding here is like bias downwards, if your prior is that people have an insatiable appetite for education. So I think that's kind of like my response to that. There's kind of like another way too that you could take your question, which is really to say, to what extent is this measure of efficiency kind of like a comprehensive notion of efficiency? And I think that it's definitely like a legitimate criticism of what we have here. So we have here like a very private notion of efficiency, in the sense that what you really care about is the impact of the school spending only on your local house prices. And so, for example, you might think that this is pretty conservative to the extent that maybe there are kids from outside of your school district that can come to your school district. And so in some sense, like we're not really measuring the impact on the house prices of adjacent like census tracts to your school district that could also benefit from your schools being better. We're comfortable with like having this as a benchmark, in part because it follows the literature, and also in part because we think that this may be a little bit more conservative than an estimate of efficiency that takes into account spillovers. There are also like lots of other issues that relate to like equity, insofar as like there may be some people who can't afford homes, and so in some ways we're going to be missing some of that texture. The way that we think about this, Hassan, is like these are really like old questions, and the approach that we're advocating for in this paper is really helping us to make progress on these questions. It's certainly not going to be the definitive word on these topics, but we hope that, you know, what our paper does is really says to folks that you can tackle like a really big, ambitious question like this and continue to like sharpen our answer on this. So that's our hope if you walk away from this talk with that perspective. Awesome. Let me talk about the data. There are going to be three main sources of data that we're going to use. And ultimately, we're going to construct a panel of house price indices, school finance variables, and then also the first year of the court mandated school finance reforms. Our house price data is going to come from the Federal Housing Finance Agency. And this is going to be a local index of constant quality house prices in each of these census tracts. We're going to aggregate this up to the school district level, and we're also going to account for the extent to which we have coverage of all of the census tracts within a given school district. So you're going to see some controls for like data coverage quality to really capture the fact that there are some places where in some years we don't have like perfect data coverage quality. The second set of data, our educational data, are going to come from the NCES and the Common Core of Data. And this is going to give us a panel of spending, of taxes, of school demographics, a lot of the standard school district variables. The third is going to be the coding of the first year of these state Supreme Court school finance reforms, which we're going to pull directly from the Jackson, Johnson, and Persico paper. And we're going to focus on these court mandated reforms under the assumption that like the state Supreme Court decisions and the timing of that is going to be plausibly a bit more random than, say, for example, the legislative efforts that they're going to kind of stimulate. And so that's our reason for choosing the court mandated reforms as opposed to the legislative reforms. What you can see is that starting with Serrano and Priest in 1971 to the present, these school finance reforms have really rolled out across space over time. And we're going to be leveraging the different timings, the different exposures of states to these school finance reforms over time. And we're also going to be leveraging the within state variation in terms of the bite of these reforms, where in particular, these reforms are going to impact the spending of school districts that were lower in the pre-reform spending distribution than school districts that were in the upper echelons of the pre-reform spending distribution.
So Peter, may I just ask you a question about the reforms?
Yeah.
You're not following the same procedure that was done in the original study, if I understand you correctly. You're going by when the court actually handed down the decision rather than when the legislature implemented the decision, which I think is what was done in the original study.
When you say the original study, Paul, you're talking about the Jackson, Johnson, and Persico paper?
Yeah.
So in their paper, they used the court mandated reforms. There are others, so for example, like Rothstein, Schanzenbach, and LaFortune, I think they used the legislative reforms, but in the Jackson, Johnson, Persico paper, they used the court mandated reforms.
There's a lot of ambiguity in that article. I've never been able to quite figure out for sure what they did because as I read their paper, they say that they are using the date that the legislature passes the law that conforms to what the court has required.
Yeah, I'm pretty confident that they use the date of the court dates. Yeah, I'm pretty confident in that. There are others who use the legislative reforms, but I'm pretty confident that they don't.
Peter, but the other thing that they do is they have different types of reform, right? they have 4 different foundation model, the 4
Yeah.
different models, which is information from the legislative response, because that's not sort of inherent in the judgment itself, right?
Yeah. So what they do in their paper is, so you can think about 2 things. You can think about what they try to do is to predict school spending using as much information as they have. And so you can have like the type of reform, like when the reform happened and so on and so forth. And then a lot of that is going to be endogenous. And what they show is that you can actually like get out of this plausibly exogenous variation by just focusing in on the pre-reform like quartile of expenditure. And so in some sense, what they end up doing is averaging across like all of these reform types across all of these different states at the pre-reform quartile level. And so in a sense, the identifying variation really is saying, what is the average impact of a school finance reform on a district that was in the lowest spending quartiles prior to the reform? What's the average impact for districts that were in the second quartile, and so on and so forth? And so in doing this averaging at the pre-reform quartile level, what they're doing is purging it from the individual level responses of individual like legislatures or individual school districts. And so the way in which they use the reform type and a lot of these other components is really to kind of like predict as much as possible like what the variation is, and then test for like the strength of these instruments in terms of generating a very strong first stage without using the district level or the state like reform level like data. I hope that clarifies it.
Got it.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. And for our context too, it's important to note that we're really going to be using those instruments like instrumentally in the purest sense of the word. Insofar as we are treating the school, this paper is not specifically interested in the school finance reforms. This paper really sees the school finance reforms as generating potentially exogenous variation in school spending and taxes, which we're going to use to estimate the elasticity of house prices with respect to school spending and with respect to taxes. And so in some sense, like this paper uses the school finance reforms instrumentally. It's not like about the school finance reforms per se. And so I think that that's a really important distinction for us to make in this context. You know, if we had...
but I do, Peter, I do think you are relying very much on the idea that the court decision is exogenous.
Yes.
And do you really believe that?
So I'll show you the event study figures. So in some sense, like, you know, you can never really like test completely the exogeneity restriction unless you have like an RCT. And in our context, you know, we don't have that. So I can't say with 100% certainty that it is. You can think that it's plausibly a bit more exogenous than the legislative actions. But what we're going to show you in a couple of slides.
For one thing, we know from other research on this that decisions by state Supreme Courts are implemented much more faithfully if Democrats are in control of the state legislature than if Republicans are, or if it's a divided government situation.
Yeah.
That sort of implies that, you know, it's an interactive process between the legislature and the court as to what actually does happen, and also if anything happens.
Yeah.
There are under which nothing happens. So lots of them.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
I believe this is exogenous is my question.
Yeah. So I think, so there are 2 ways to think about it. You know, recently we had an uprising in our country, and the president was very unhappy that the Supreme Court, some of the members whom we put in the Supreme Court didn't side with him. That was, in some sense, that was kind of a random shock to the former president. And so there are often times in which, like, you know, justices might disagree with the people that put them there. And so there is some element of like randomness there, in a way that's like very different from like if somebody is like a Democrat or Republican, like maybe it's a little bit more predictable in terms of like what they're going to do. I think the second part to really keep in mind, and this is on point in terms of what's going to be really central to what we do in this paper, recognizing that the implementation might vary by legislature, recognizing that it might vary by the type of specific reform that's enacted. what the identification strategy deliberately does is to average over a lot of that idiosyncratic variation and to effectively like just use the average response or the average impact by quartile of pre-reform spending. And so that's exactly the reason why in the original Jackson, Johnson, and Percival paper, they look at the average response within the pre-reform quartile as opposed to like looking at what happens in a specific legislature or a specific state. So that gets at the core of it. Building on that, Paul, so the key things that I want you to take away from the school finance reforms is that there are many different ways that you can implement them. It could be a foundation grant that's going to guarantee a certain amount of per pupil funding. It could be a district power equalization that offers, guaranteed tax base. The core idea is that there's always going to be some redistributive element of these like school finance reforms in terms of how they're going to be implemented. And this is going to create both impacts in terms of like spending, where you're going to see equalization of spending between the lowest pre-reform spending districts and the highest pre-reform spending districts. And so you can think about that as the first stage. The second thing too is this is going to create different tax incentives for districts. In particular, the lower pre-reform, the districts that were spending less prior to the reforms, on average, they're going to have greater incentives to increase their taxes. And the districts that were already spending a lot on schools, they're going to have incentives to reduce their taxes. And so you're going to also get these tax responses as well too, which we show in this paper that are going to be generated from the variation that's caused by the school finance reform. So we're going to leverage that additional variation too. Before showing you the event study figures, I want to make a pretty like fine point. So formally, our instruments are really going to be what they're going to be dummies for like what quartile a particular school district was in the state distribution of schools per pupil school spending prior to the reform, interacted with the time since reform. And so if we have T post-reform time periods and we have 4 quartiles, formally we're going to have 4 times T instruments, and we're going to have 2 endogenous regressors, which are going to be spending and taxes. And so formally we're going to be over-identified. And you can think about the elasticities that we're estimating as being identified off of differences in terms of when the spending responses are kicking in versus when the tax responses are going to be kicking in. And so this is something that allows us to do the exercise that we currently do. And I want to make sure and flag that. Okay. There are going to be 2 types of regressions that we're going to run. So let me just walk through these. And then after this, I'm going to show you the event study plots and then also the regression results. So the most basic regression we're going to run is a regression of the log of the house price index in district D at time period T on the log of per pupil spending in that district at that time period. We're going to control for district fixed effects, that's these FD here. And we're also going to control for pre-trends in district characteristics using like variables from like the census in the 1960s, just to exactly follow the Jackson, Johnson, and Percival study. And so in some sense, we're going to be estimating off of like deviations from trend relative to the pre-reform time period. And for these first sets of specifications, the core parameter of interest is going to be theta, which is going to be the elasticity of house prices with respect to school spending. And I should mention that we're going to be using the pre-reform quartile dummies interacted with time since event as instruments for spending in equation 1. In equation 2, we're going to augment the specification by adding in per pupil tax revenues. And again, we're going to use those instruments, which we argued are over-identified, to get this elasticity of house prices with respect to taxes, which is captured by phi. We're going to do a lot of the standard things in terms of like, weighting. We're going to add in controls for like the quality of the data in terms of how much coverage we have. We're also going to add in changes in like the introduction of Head Start in the various states and time since the introduction of Head Start, just to try to account for as many background things as possible.
So Peter, one of the, maybe I don't understand this quite right, but it seems to me that these reforms are generally increasing the amount of money coming to the district from the state. So ordinarily, they order the state legislature to increase expenditures. And I guess the state could impose that increase on the districts, but I'm quite sure that usually they don't. They pay for it out of the state coffers. So the question is, isn't this just free money coming into the district? And so if they get free money coming into the district, wouldn't that just raise house prices?
Yeah, so certainly when we come to, so that's going to be one of the reasons why we want to estimate like the tax response as well. And so our efficiency calculation really is going to the extent that you believe our tax elasticity, our efficiency calculation is going to say, if you were to increase taxes specifically to spend on house prices, like what would happen? Now, you know, you might push back and say, well, increases that come from free money might have like a very different like elasticity than increases that come from being like tax funded. And that could certainly be the case. One thing that we are going to do that might give you some solace is we're going to combine these instruments in like different ways to get at. So for example, we can compare the variation between the top two quartiles versus the bottom two quartiles, or, you know, like the top three versus the last one. And in some sense, you can think about the extent to which you're getting free money is going to be varying a lot depending on like what the, depending on what variation we use in the data. What we're going to show is that these house price elasticities are going to be pretty similar across the entire distribution. And so
wouldn't you really want to show that an increase in the cost to the taxpayer living within the district is that house prices are not adversely affected by an increase in the costs to the people living in the district that's going to be imposed upon the people who live in that district?
Let me defer that question just for a moment. I'll have something to say about that when I get to the robustness slides, but let me defer that question just for a moment. I'm going to show you all some of the headline results, and I think we can have a deeper conversation on that, Paul. I'm going to show you a series of event study plots where on the horizontal axis, it's going to be time since the school finance reform. And so positive time periods will be years after the school finance reform. Negative periods are going to be times prior to the school finance reform. And on the vertical axis is either going to be the change in the log of spending or the change in the log of house prices. And I'm going to show you these event study plots separately by the quartile. So the blue is going to be Q1, or the lowest pre-reform spending quartile. The red is going to be Q2. The green is going to be Q3. And all of this is going to be relative to the highest spending pre-reform quartile, which is going to be Q4. And so you should think about these as like relative to that. What you can see from this figure is that prior to the reform, that we were able to successfully eliminate like any of the pre-trends. But then after the reform, we see that there's an increase in school spending, specifically in the Q1 districts that were prior to the reform spending a lot less than the Q4 districts. We also see an increase in the Q2 districts, and the Q3 districts we see like less of an increase relative to the Q4 districts. This is very similar to like what you have from the Jackson, Johnson, and Percival paper. And so this is like replicating their first stage for the school spending. And so clearly these reforms are having some impact on school spending. In the second figure, we show you a similar event study, but for house prices. And what you can see here is that prior to the reform, we don't have like any major pre-trends coming into the reform, but after the reform, we see an increase in house prices, specifically in the Q1 districts, which are the places that had the largest increases in school spending. And just from looking at these two figures, you can almost like calculate like the reduced form elasticities, right? Which are going to be around about like a 15% increase in the house prices for a 1% increase in the school spending. So you'd expect elasticities on the order of around like 1 to like 1.5-ish. Okay. Let me show you some of the regression results. This is for the first specification in which we regress the log of house price indices on the log of per pupil expenditures. And as we go across the columns, we have more detailed controls. The headline finding from this is the following. A 1% increase in house prices is going to increase, sorry, a 1% increase in per pupil expenditures is going to increase house prices by between 0.8 to like 1%. So school spending is going to be highly capitalized into house prices. To put this in context, from the Jackson Johnson and Persico paper, they find an elasticity of future wages with respect to school spending of about 0.7 to 0.8. And so the elasticity that we find here is within the same ballpark of the elasticities that they find for wages. There's an important interpretation point that I want to highlight for us. We don't want you to walk away from this paper saying that if you were to double school spending, that house prices would double. No. Instead, the variation in the data that we're using is variation of about 5 to 10% in school spending. And so you really should be thinking about something more in the order of, if you were to increase school spending by about 5%, that you'd expect to see house prices go up by about 4 to 5%. So that second piece is an interpretation piece. Now we get into the segment that Marty was asking about, which is like, why do we disaggregate by the type of spending? There's a growing literature showing that spending on salaries is particularly impactful in terms of student outcomes. Also, the classic argument in Hanushak too is that it doesn't just matter that you spend money, it matters how you spend the money. And so that's another reason why we think it's important to separate these out. The third reason is that a lot of the non-salary inputs, in particular spending on infrastructure, oftentimes is financed using bond referenda. And so in some sense, for that type of spending, the tax liabilities could already be capitalized into the house prices themselves, which may obviate the need for us to estimate a separate tax elasticity in those contexts too. This is the vet study figure for just the salary spending. And what we see here is that the variation for the salary spending is even more clean than the variation that we got for the overall spending, where there's like an incredibly like flat, like non-existent pre-trend relative to the Q4 districts. And what we see is after the school finance reforms, there's a uniform increase in salary spending, with the largest increase happening at the lowest pre-reform quartiles. When we look at what this elasticity is, we get an elasticity of salary spending, of house prices with respect to salary spending of about 2. And this is across all of these different specifications. And so salary spending is highly capitalized into house prices. Here we do something similar looking at non-salary spending. And what you can see here is that the non-salary spending is going to be comparatively like a lot lumpier and a bit noisier too. We do see an increase in non-salary spending in the Q1 districts, but in the Q3 districts, this kind of oscillates like around 0. And so the variation here is a little bit noisier. When we look at the capitalization of non-salary spending, what we're going to find is that in contrast to the capitalization of the salary spending, we get like an economic 0, something that's pretty small. And that's also statistically insignificant as well too.
So how do you define non-salary, Peter?
So this is just the complement of salary spending. So in the data, we have like salary spending like pretty clearly defined, and we just include everything that's not salary spending into that. To give you a sense of this, about 55% of the spending is going to be salary on salary inputs, and about 45% is going to be non-salary spending. Yeah, no. I'll get to your point, Ira, in the conclusion in terms of like what this means for quantity versus the quality of teachers. So, some of the key takeaways is that, overall, the overall capitalization of school spending into house prices is largely going to be driven by the impacts on salary spending, whereas the non-salary spending, it seems to have like a near 0 capitalization into house prices. And that could reflect the fact that, some of the non-salary spending is financed based on these bond referenda such that the tax liability is already capitalized, in which case you could really think about these non-salary elasticities as really a direct test of like a direct efficiency test, right? As opposed to like reflecting the capitalization itself. We argued previously that the instruments that are used are formally over-identified. And so we're going to use that to project out like variation in taxes as well. And what you can see, very clearly here is that, after the passage of these school finance reforms, you almost see an immediate like uptick in taxes in the lowest spending districts. Now, it's important to recognize that this is relative to the Q4 districts. And so a big part of this is going to be like a reduction in the taxes in the Q4 districts. And some of it is going to be a modest increase in taxes in the Q1 districts. And so this is something, the fact that a lot of this is like kicking in like very soon after these court mandated reforms is going to allow us to separately identify like the salary variation, which kind of increased a lot more smoothly from some of the tax variation that we saw in the data.
Peter, what's the intuition for why property taxes would change like that? Is it, I mean, you just helpfully reminded us that it's relative to the Q4, but it seems like to some extent the opposite of like a flypaper effect or the, it's the opposite of what you might expect, which is you get the free money Paul was talking about, so you reduce your own tax effort.
Yeah, it's a good question. So I don't have a great answer for you, to be honest with you. Like, this is what we find empirically. I think the other thing to keep in mind is that oftentimes the tax changes that we see are happening in equilibrium, and so those are kind of endogenous. Like, what we're trying to do is to project out kind of what those average responses are across like all of these different states. But that's something that we have to dig into a bit more. But I don't have a great answer for you right now. So what we can do now is we can re-estimate our model where we look at the impact of taxes on house prices. And what we can see there are two things to take away. So the first, taxes are going to be negatively capitalized into house prices with an elasticity of about minus 0.15. The second thing to keep in mind is even after introducing a rule for taxes, our spending capitalizations look very similar to what they were before. And so this suggests us that we're really getting like orthogonal variation in the spending and in the taxes, because we're seeing these spending estimates like not change appreciably from a model in which we only had a rule for spending. Okay. Now what we want to do is like really put these two things together and look at a model in which we have the spending disaggregated into salary versus non-salary and a rule for taxes. And from here, what we're going to do is then really zoom into the salary spending and do our efficiency test with respect to the salary spending, precisely because some of the non-salary spending we believe could be already funded by future tax liabilities that's associated with the bond referenda. And so I want to draw your attention to column 3, where we have salary spending, column 2, where we have salary spending, non-salary spending, and property taxes. And what you can see is that salary spending is going to be entering positively, and across the board we see that whether we just have salary spending by itself, salary spending and non-salary spending, we're going to see an elasticity of around about 2 for the salary spending. The non-salary spending, by contrast, the point estimates are going to be a bit more sensitive to the specific specification, ranging from like -0.5 to about -0.2. So we're pretty confident that these salary spending estimates are going to be are very reliably estimated. Also, to like our tax elasticities, come in pretty strongly at -0.25. And these standard errors are really large, and so we're looking at t-stats of around about like 5 or 6. To implement our efficiency test, and I'm conscious of time, so I think I have maybe just like 2 more slides, so I'll be able to kind of like hit the headlines and then about an additional like 7 minutes for conversation. The way that we implement the OATS test is to consider what's the percent change in house prices that would arise from a 1% increase in tax revenues that's used to fund spending on salaries. And so what we do to implement that is a 1% increase in tax revenues converted into a percent increase in school spending on salaries is going to be about a 0.55% increase in salary spending at the mean. And that's because on average, salary spending is going to be a lot higher than the tax revenues that's going to be used to fund like school spending overall. Now, once we have these 2 numbers, we can use the elasticities that we estimated on the previous page to combine these 2 elasticities. And so in particular, the change in house prices resulting from this tax-funded increase in salary spending is going to first decrease house prices by -0.25%, but that's going to come from the tax response. And then the more expenditures on salary is going to increase house prices by like 2.2% times the increase in the salary spending at the mean. Combining these two things together, we're going to get what we're calling an efficiency elasticity of about 1.03. And so what that means is that a tax-funded 1% increase in school spending on salaries is going to be predicted to increase house prices by about 1%. And the 95% confidence interval is what we have reported here on this figure. And so we're not going to be able to rule out efficiency elasticities as small as about 0.6. And we're also not going to be, but we are going to be able to rule out efficiency elasticities that's larger than like 1.5. And so again, like a lot of this is like very precisely estimated. And so we're getting something that's economically large and statistically significant. Yeah, and this table just shows you those efficiency elasticities. All right, there are a couple of different things that we do that I want to just talk through like very briefly. So the first is that you might wonder like how much of this is really coming through the direct effect of school spending on the households that live in the neighborhood, and how much of this might come from sorting. And I think this is a little bit related to Paul's question from earlier in the talk. And so what we do, and this is a little bit informal, is first we do show that there is sorting. And so that makes sense. I mean, house prices are changing, the amount that you're spending on schools is changing, like there should be sorting. If there were not sorting, that would be actually very surprising. And so I'm not going to sit here and tell you that there's not sorting. And so what we can do is we can re-estimate our model where we add in the fraction of kids that are on free and reduced price lunch, and combine the size of the coefficients in a model with and without this control for like the level of like income-based sorting. And the headline finding from this is that in our model with this informal control for sorting, what we find is that the estimated elasticities are going to be about 70% smaller. And so we can partition these effects to saying that about, like more than 2/3 of the effect is coming from the direct impact of spending, and about 1/3-ish is coming from the indirect sorting effects. The second thing that you might be worried about is that these elasticities that we're estimating are themselves like local average treatment effects. And it could be that we're combining like lates from the spending that are very different from the lates that we're getting from the taxes, and that whole efficiency calculation then becomes a little bit messy. And so what we do is there are several ways that we could have constructed our instruments. We could have aggregated our instruments into these quartiles, or we could have aggregated them into like above median and below median, or the top 3 quartiles versus the bottom 3 quartiles, and all of these permutations, all of the above permutations. And each of these different aggregations, that's not going to affect the pre-trends, because remember our pre-trends were like more or less 0, but it would affect in some sense kind of like what we think of as being kind of the marginal group. And when we do that exercise, we find that there's a lot of like homogeneity in terms of the estimated elasticities that we do have here in the paper. I'll just show you these really briefly. So for example, in column 1, we look at each of the spending quartiles separately. In column 2, we do Q1 versus the top 3 quartiles. In column 3, we split it, above versus below median. And in column 4, we do the bottom 3 quartiles versus the top. And what you can see is that, the overall spending elasticity looks pretty similar. The overall like tax elasticity looks pretty similar. If we zoom in on the salary spending again, what we can see is that there is some differences in these results, but there's a lot of overlap in terms of the confidence intervals for the spending capitalization elasticities. And similarly for the tax elasticities as well too. And so what this suggests to us is that in some sense, like really what we're finding is something that's like broadly applicable, like across the pre-reform like spending distribution. Like we think that these have pretty good internal validity and external validity. The third thing that we do is you might worry that house prices are going to capitalize future spending on schools. And so what we do is we regress today's today's house prices on like tomorrow's spending on schools, just to see the extent to which our capitalization estimates will change. And we find that if anything, like our estimates using contemporaneous school spending and contemporaneous house prices are actually conservative relative to what you would find if you did like if you regressed on leads. Let me wrap up and then like leave a minute or two for discussion. So, you know, the key headlines is that our work is going to speak to these two really classic questions in economics about like whether we can provide public goods efficiently if we provide them locally, and also the extent to which like school spending is going to matter. Methodologically, we propose a method that is going to allow us to jointly estimate the two elasticities that are relevant for us to calculate to speak to these two questions. And we do it in a way that allows us to use publicly available data, which broadens the generalizability of our results, because we can go, you know, back in time quite a bit and across space. And the data restrictions or requirements are not like super onerous precisely because of the way that we've set things up. And there are a couple headlines. So the first is that school spending matters. When house prices, when school expenditure increases in a plausibly exogenous way, we see an increase in house prices. How the money is spent also matters very crucially. So like Rick was certainly right in terms of emphasizing that point. Third, the fact that house prices are responsive to school spending corroborates a lot of the new like quasi-experimental evidence showing that increased school spending impacts students like test scores and their labor market outcomes. We have a situation in which like parents are like potentially like previewing these impacts and like valuing them as capitalized into the house prices. We can also test and show that spending on salaries is inefficiently low. And we do some things in the paper where we try to look at the extent to which this is coming from like the quality versus the quantity dimension, like either like reducing student to teacher ratios or like paying teachers more. And we find that both of these, both of like households value like both like lower student to teacher ratios, and they also value like paying, like effectively paying like teachers more. And we can't really separately disentangle these two things. We think that may be asking maybe a little bit too much of the data. And in terms of the policy implications, I mean, like we can think about, you know, impacting either, you know, teacher quality by like increasing wages or increasing the supply of teachers. And both of those are going to be consistent with, you know, other literature showing that, you know, high value add teachers really do impact student outcomes. Let me stop there, and I probably have a minute for like another question.
Well, yeah, we don't have much time until 1 o'clock. Peter, do you have a hard stop at 1? Or
No, I don't have a hard stop at 1.
We'll let people sign off as they need to. And before they do, I'll thank you for a very interesting presentation. And maybe we can allow a few minutes for questions at least. I'll start off how other people are getting ready. I mean, is it right that essentially the interpretation you're offering is that in most communities across the US, homeowners at least would be better off financially if they voted to raise their taxes and devote those resources to salary spending? Or they might be even better off if they reallocated from other areas of local spending to teacher salaries, because then their taxes don't even go up. So what's the, where's the market failure, or what's the political economy story that you think is preventing that from happening? Are people, is it one of ignorance? Is it, it's hard for me to understand the interest group. It seems like the interest group pressure, if we think of unions, would push in the other direction. So, so just what's your interpretation of what's behind these results?
Yeah. So the big question is, I think that you've just opened up a new vista for like more research that's going to be inspired by our work. Like we don't have anything directly to say about that in the paper here. And I don't want to speculate about that because it could vary from place to place. But I think that one of the things that our paper does do is really put this question on the table as to like, why is it the case that we're potentially underinvesting in spending specifically on salaries? Because you're absolutely right. You can think about this as like, within keep expenditure fixed, but then reallocate more towards salaries and away from some of the other stuff. You can think about it as like just spend more overall. And even if like some of the spending is not super useful, at least you're going to be getting like about 60% of it sticking on salaries. If I had to hazard a guess, like some of it might be inertial, right? Like a lot of times like spending is like very kind of inertial, and the variation that we're using in some sense is kind of like providing an external shock to the system, right? And so that would be kind of like, I think that would be like the go-to place that I think that would be like where I would go.
Interesting. So maybe inertia keeps districts from responding to like a Baumol type model in the way they need to, would be one possible interpretation.
Yeah, and at least that would be consistent with the fact that the identifying variation that we're having is like coming from this external shock. That would be my top guess. Yeah.
Other questions?
Questions, yeah. And comments are welcome too. And Tony, I see you smiling, so I may pick on you.
Ira, Ira was raising his hand.
Oh, hi,
Get him
Ira.
in there.
Yeah, I mean, if you're a renter, you actually might want lower home prices because then you might be able to afford to buy a house. So I wonder, some of these districts actually have large percentage of renter voters, like homeowners might actually be in a minority. So I wonder if like the renter effect, where you're actually rooting for lower home values. I used to be in that condition myself in renting an apartment in New York, and like hoping that home prices would get low enough for me to afford to buy a house. You know, and that was at a time when there was a fight over school finance reform in New York. So I wonder if you could look at like percentage of people who are renters versus homeowners, and if that might explain some of this inefficiency over school spending.
Yeah, that's a good point. So we could, for example, like maybe like look at the fraction of folks that like prior to the reform that are renters, and like interact that with our capitalization elasticities to see if in places, if there's heterogeneity in terms of the response. That's it. Yeah, that's another hypothesis. Thanks a lot, Ira. That's great.
Other questions or comments?
I'll put you on the spot again, Antonio, because I saw like an inkling of something there, if that's okay with you.
Antonio, you're on mute.
Oh, I think, yeah, you're on mute, Antonio.
I'm sorry. I'm just trying to digest all of this information. This is quite a great study, and I still haven't quite wrapped my head around some of this stuff. I am a homeowner, and we do have these issues here in our town about school spending. Let me hold my question and perhaps reach out to you after this talk.
All right. Well, not hearing from anyone else, I will now take the opportunity to thank Peter again and let you all know that we'll be back 2 weeks from today. I believe we have a presentation from a research team at the University of Virginia looking at how the shift to online instruction affected outcomes for community college students in the past year. And so that will be 2 weeks from today, same Zoom format. And Peter has put his email into the chat if you want to get in touch with him in any way. So thanks everyone for being here, and we will see you back soon.
Yeah. Thank you all so much for having me. This was terrific. Thank you for all the great questions and the great suggestions too. And feel free to send things my way. Awesome. Thanks.
Take care.
Everybody. Take care.
Thanks. Thank you. Thanks, Marty. Thanks, Antonio.
You're very welcome.